Welcome to part 2 of the Retrofit Crash Course sub-series. It's part of my broader Android native development crash course. We'll pick up from where we left off last time. Moshi builder complete. You'll see I also there was an erroneous import up here that I just took out, but it was based on the previous package structure. Now we are seeing less red in our class, which is also always a good thing. And let's just keep stepping through it. And the next thing to look at is this retrofit object that we've built. So this retrofit object allows us to define our converter factory, which is a Moshi converter which we create using our Moshi object that we created above, and as well as a coroutine call adapter factory. And we'll look at coroutines in a bit. You also specify your base URL for the API that you'll be accessing, the web service, as part of building this thing, and then you build it. Okay. Now we get to our actual interface definition. So this not class that I created, interface, but this file that I created is called Bifrost API service, and this is the interface for that. Okay, and in this case I've now created a method for that responds to an HTTP GET request. Okay, so there's an annotation there we go, it's inside of Retrofit 2, and that annotation allows you to specify a value, which is basically the other part of the URL other than the base URL. So you can think of the URL that it's going to hit to retrieve the data as this piece plus this piece. Okay. Alright, and what you then specify is just the name of the method. It's just called get here, but let's call it maybe something else, get water levels. Okay, or rather get most recent water level, right? And yeah, we don't actually really need this to be a list. I just wanted to show you that you can actually return a list of objects. So this is a deferred result. I won't go through what that is just yet. We'll see how we use it in a bit. But I could have returned a list of DTOs, like a series of objects. Like I could have returned all the water levels over the past year or whatever. But in this particular case, we don't actually need it to be a list. So we'll just return an object, a single object. And the class I'm going to be creating to encapsulate this data is called network water level. Network is a common prefix, at least as far as I've seen within Android development. And what a good pattern is to separate concerns, and if you do some courses and stuff on this, you'll see that this is quite a common thing that the guys over at Google do, at least, where they would create almost 3 versions of the same object, like a domain one, a database one, and a network one for a typical kind of application with a SQLite database and using Retrofit to access some data. But then you'd create 3 versions, and the network one, and they would often create converters to convert from the one type of object to the other. These objects are usually very similar, but there is a lot of benefit, even though it seems like repeated code. There is a lot of benefit to that separation of concerns. So this network water level, you can think of it as a DTO, as a data transfer object. If you've worked on other code bases, that's probably a term you're familiar with, but I'm going to stick with the naming conventions and patterns that I've seen, at least in the Android courses that I've done. Okay, and we'll create this object shortly. It'll be a very simple object. And then we create a Bifrost API object over here, and one method in that, which is this one called Retrofit, which is, well, sorry, not one method, but one value in that, called Retrofit service, and it's lazily created, and basically we just say retrofit.create, and then we specify the name of our API, and that's it. That's it for our Bifrost API service. So let's go ahead, and now next thing we'll do is create this class, and then we could start looking at how to actually use this thing to get some data. Okay, so let's have a look at now actually creating this DTO, network water level. Okay, so Alt Enter, create class, network water level, extract a separate file, and yeah, let's just put it in network again. And I'm going to actually make this a data class, which is perfectly suited for DTOs. So if you're working with Kotlin, it's a really cool thing to use for DTOs and other kinds of things as well. Alright, and now what I've done here is I've just added 2 fields, okay, and I've purposely included the JSON annotation for one but not the other. So this first field is just the water level ID. Now because I haven't included this JSON annotation, I have not been able to specify what the name of the actual attribute would be in the JSON that we're receiving, okay. So it's going to assume that it's the same as the name of this. So inside of the JSON that we receive from our API, there should be a field called water level ID with a value, and it should be parsable as a long. And then there would be a second field, which now in our code, inside of this application, inside of our app code, we want to refer to this thing as water level measurement in cm, so in centimeters. But let's assume for now that this is just called water level in the XML, in the JSON that we receive from the server that we're accessing, from the API that we're calling. So by specifying this JSON annotation, it allows us to give a different name compared to what we actually want to use in our code. In this case, this should be parsable as a double. Now, we will probably come back and change this later. These are not the actual things necessarily being used by the API. Just wanted to, at this point, show you how to create the DTO and just explain what this JSON annotation does and when you have to have it and when you don't have to have it, etc. And it's as simple as that. And now if we go back to our Bifrost API service, we'll see that we have no more red left. We've got a bit of yellow for unused things, but that's because we aren't using the service yet. And that's the next piece. So our service is now written in its entirety, at least for this one web service call. And yeah, let's start using it. Now if we actually run the code that we've written so far to see if it works, you'll see that nothing happens at all. And the reason for that is, I think, reasonably obvious. We've created the service for accessing our external third-party web server, a web service rather, and we haven't actually used it anyway. So that's the problem. Now you could use it directly, like for example, when the fragment loads up, or when the screen loads up, or the activity loads up in the app, you could just call it directly. Eventually I will be changing what I want to show you now, but I thought this is a good opportunity to show you how you could also use the Worker Manager, which is a feature or a new part of the Android toolkit, specifically Android Jetpack. And this Worker Manager you can use for setting up like scheduled tasks or scheduled work. And we're going to set one up that runs every 30 seconds, that goes and actually fetches the most recent water level, and then we're just going to store that in memory. In the long term, it's something you'd probably want to store in a database, and we'll look at that later when we look at SQLite and Room and things like that. But for now, let's just have a look at what this involves. So let's kind of work backwards. So from the Bifrost API service, we'll go back and first look at something that I created inside a new package called repository. So this is a repository specifically for water levels, and this is where we actually will call the API service over there, and that will get us the most recent water level, like a deferred object, which we then call the await method on that inside a try catch, and that's what will actually then return the water level itself. In this case, that is a specific kind of object. If we have a look at it, it is a network, called the object network water level, which is just a data class that contains the data that it's getting from the server. I showed you something similar to this earlier. You'll see I've changed the fields, and I don't need the JSON annotations anymore because the field names now match up with those that it's receiving from the external server, so I don't need to override the names. So if we go back to the repository, what we see is that I've created a method for refreshing these water levels. In this case, we're currently just doing the most recent one, and that's where we get that value, and I'm just for now printing it out to logcat. And then so long as well, I'm updating what's called a live data object, which I'm not using fully yet, and I'll explain what this live data stuff is in a bit, and I'll show you how you can use it to easily show something on the actual fragment so the user can see it. And that's it for now. I've got a method for accessing that live data, but as you can see, it's unused currently, so let's not worry about that. So this is it for the repository, and I'll do a separate video on the difference between like a repository and a DAO or a data access object and these kinds of things. But this is a good pattern to follow. So it's worth reading up about what repositories are, and like I say, I'll cover the theory around it in a different video. But this is just a crash course. So if we have a look at the next thing, which is the Drizzleheim application, so your application class. In my case, it's called Drizzleheim application, whatever you called it. I've added a few more methods around this stuff with workers, and I'm also using coroutines now. So we created the delayed init function for setting up the recurring work inside a separate application scope, and I've got a bunch of commented out code here just to show you like the kinds of things you can do with the work manager. You see, you could set up some constraints. In my case, I don't really have constraints. I'm just using the defaults. But you could set up constraints to say only run this if there's an unmetered network type available, only if the battery is not low, only if the phone is on charge. And then you could even do things for specific build versions, like if the build version is greater than this one, then the device must be idle in order for this scheduled task to run, the scheduled work to run. And then you create a repeating request using those constraints. And you can also say, you know, periodically how often this should run. In my case, I'm saying for now, let's do every 30 seconds. You then use the work manager, you get an instance of it, and you enqueue the unique periodic work. This refresh data worker is the thing that actually contains the logic that will be executed when it's time for this to run. And I've given it, you give it a specific name, and that's just a constant that I've got here. And then you say whether or not you are intending on keeping or replacing, and I've explained in the comment there what that means. You can just read that, it's quite self-explanatory. And then you actually give it the repeating request. This piece of commented out code here is an alternative to what I've just shown you, and this is if you just want to make the work a one-time request. So you just want it to execute once as opposed to a repeating schedule, and you wouldn't need any constraints or repeating request object or anything like that. So yeah, so that's it. In order to get this to work, when you first put this code in, you'll see there's a bunch of red, and that's obviously because we haven't included our necessary dependencies. So again, in this case, there's a version work as well as also a version coroutine, because I'm going to include coroutines as well at this point. And then inside of my other build Gradle, you can see that's where I've included coroutines and work. So those are the three dependencies. Technically you only really need this bottom one for work, but since I'm using coroutines from this point onwards, I've included all of those. So that this is just actually the JetBrains stuff, so you don't have to have those two. Okay, and then if we have a look at it now, if we actually run the app, my device is plugged in, it's going to be running on my phone and just popping up, and it's not really going to say anything more than what I've shown previously in the screenshot, so I'm not going to show you what the phone's doing now. Just want to show you what's coming out in the logs. Okay, so while this is busy running, this is actually from the previous run. So you can see it set up the recurring work, completed setting it up. It ran the refresh data worker, it called the API, so it's just doing it again. See, it actually called it there now. And then it has got a successful call. So we've made a successful call to the remote REST or HTTP endpoint, and you can see it's returned a network level object with this data. The ID is 1, the measurement in centimeters is 10, the maximum level is 20, and this is the data it's recorded, which is just today's data. I'll put in some test data there. So yeah, so there we have it running. Now if you actually try to run it, just doing what I've shown you so far, you would first get an error, and that error is because I haven't yet shown you how to add the permission for the internet to this app. So that's very simple. You would get an error, and it's very explicit. It would tell you that that permission's missing, and all you need is in your Android manifest XML to add that one line that I've highlighted to say that this uses the internet permission, because you are accessing this data across the internet using Retrofit, calling this HTTP service, this external one. You do need to grant that permission to the application. And yeah, that's as simple as it is now for actually finishing off the whole, making a call to a REST endpoint, and then I've shown you the Worker Manager stuff as well. Yeah, which you don't have to use the two, obviously. You could have just accessed this data differently, but it's a nice thing to have, knowledge about the Work Manager. It's quite a cool thing in Jetpack. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this interesting and useful, and that you learned something, and that Retrofit and Moshi and the various things you saw help you in your future software development endeavors. And please remember to subscribe to my channel.